Well, our readings this morning, as you will have noticed, were stories about two of the first apostles, Peter and Paul. In the reading, though, that we heard, his name was Saul. They share the same patronal festival date, that's June the 25th, 9th. They have been remembered jointly on that day since the very early days of the church, it being regarded as the anniversary of their martyrdom in Rome about the year 64. Now, Nancy read for us the story of a man called Saul, later known as Paul. He was on his way to a town called Damascus, where he was going in order to round up the Christians there, to take them back to Jerusalem for trial. Why was he going to do that? Saul was a very learned man and very religious Jew, and really felt that he was doing God's will. The Christians, he felt, were teaching of blasphemous heresy that threatened the people of God, the Jews, and the sanctity of their laws and their temple worship. Saul actually witnessed the trial and stoning of the first Christian martyr, the young Stephen. He approved of the Sanhedrin's ordering to kill him through stoning him to death. And after hearing Stephen's remarkable and condemning speech he had given to the council, Saul was even more determined to put an end to Christianity once and for all time. So off he went to Damascus. And there on the road, he was suddenly struck by this tremendous bright light, which made him fall off his horse and lose his eyesight. He heard a voice speaking to him, "Saul, why do you persecute me? I am Jesus." Saul was then taken by his companions into Damascus, and there God has spoken to a Christian man called Ananias, who he sent to Paul. And after curing Paul's blindness, he gave him the message from the Lord that God had chosen him to be the instrument to proclaim Jesus to the Gentile people. Saul then believed and was baptized. That's a fascinating story, and so is the whole story of Paul's ministry. We can read it in the book of Acts, so perhaps you'd like to read it for yourselves. Paul was confronted by Jesus himself, and his life completely changed. Then in our second reading, we meet Peter, also being confronted with Jesus. Can you just imagine how the disciples must have felt? Yes, they had seen Jesus alive. He'd visited them when they locked themselves away in the upper room. They know his resurrection was real. They heard the doubting of Thomas, and they saw the wounds that Jesus had. But what now? Jesus wasn't around anymore. They had followed him daily around Galilee and beyond for the last 3 years. So what were they to do now? Well, back they go home, back to their original lifestyle in Galilee, fishing. Jesus himself went to Galilee to meet up with the disciples. Realizing that they had been fishing all night, he would treat them to a cooked breakfast on their return to shore. He made a fire on the beach and was cooking fish to eat with bread ready for them. And as their boat came nearer the shore, he shouted to them, asking them if they'd caught much, which they hadn't. So he told them to cast their net to the other side. And as we heard, they had a massive catch. Apparently, it very often happens that someone on the seashore can see where the fish are, where the people in the boat can't. And this time it was Jesus himself acting as guide to his friends. They then had breakfast together. And this is where our two Bible readings come together. Jesus spoke to Peter. There was no strong, brilliant lights flashing. just remorseful memories flashing through Peter's mind as he listened. Let us remember on that Thursday evening of Holy Week, Peter denied knowing Jesus. Jesus was arrested in the Garden of Gethsemane and led away for his false and fatal trial. And Peter followed. Now, 3 different people over the course of the next hour recognized him as a follower of Jesus. And on each occasion, when questioned, he replied, "I do not know him." Remember that Jesus had actually told Peter this would happen before the cock would crow. And sure enough, as Peter denied for the 3rd time, a cock crowed and Jesus turned and looked at him. So what was Jesus saying to Peter now? "Peter, do you love me more than these?" Well, I wonder what or who the these were that Jesus referred to. Was he referring to the group of friends Peter had? Or perhaps his family? Or was it his job? Because Peter obviously loved fishing and enjoyed a good relationship with his friends. And of course, the money he would have earned was good. What inner torment Peter must have suffered, as 3 times, yes, another 3 times, Jesus said, "Peter, do you love me?" Jesus could easily have just patted Peter on the shoulders. "Okay, Peter, I forgive you for denying me 3 times. Forget it all now." Jesus obviously had certainly forgiven Peter. But now, as another challenge, Jesus gave Peter a job to do. Like later on, God had the specific job for Paul too. Paul was to convert the Gentiles to the Christian faith. "If you really love me, Peter, I ask you to give up your life to shepherding and loving my sheep, the people of the early church." Do you know, I wonder if perhaps John recorded this conversation between Peter and Jesus so that Peter would not be known as the disciple who denied his Lord, but the disciple who Jesus had chosen to care for all his people, the children, the lambs, and the older folk, the sheep of his newly formed church. Now, Peter and Paul were both pillars of the early church. And where would we be spiritually without these and other founders of our faith? Paul, we understand, was well educated, a deep thinker, very good at expressing his opinions, deeply grounded in the Jewish faith. He was a Pharisee. Paul's personal encounter with Jesus changed his life, and many lives that Peter touched that were changed too. He was transformed by God. And God used Paul to reach out to unbelievers, mostly the Gentiles. God took him, his background, his training, his mind, and even his weaknesses, and used him. Are we willing to let God do the same for us? But we will never know all he can do with us until we allow him to have us as we are. God will take us with all our past if we'll love him and want to surrender our lives to his will. Now, Peter, having followed Jesus for 3 years, ministering alongside him, hearing the gospel message, seeing healing and other miracles, learning how to pray, learning God's way of life and love. And there at the lakeside that early morning, he gave his life over completely to Jesus. Many of us have probably grown up in the faith, heard the stories of Jesus, being taught how to pray, how to keep God's commandments. But at some stage in our lives of faith, we do have to surrender our lives to him and be obedient to the calling God has specifically for us. Peter went on to do great things for God. Perhaps God has more great things he is calling us to do as individuals and a fellowship together. Paul and Peter both had times of testing. Both had to come to that decision to follow Jesus, to trust and obey him. He calls each one of us today, whatever our age, to love him and to follow him and to obey him. There could be many, many talks given about these two giants of the faith. We have only skimmed over their lives and commitments this morning. But what is clear to me is no matter what our past has been, and remember the words of the psalmist, that the Lord knows all about us in every way. If we answer God's call on our lives, he will receive us and he will love us. So we love him in return, and he will use each of us in his great plan of salvation here in Allerton. Amen.